Hello, everybody. This video is to work on the concept of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply graph. So I have this handout called exactly that, and it's labeled 3 places to be. So if you don't have this handout, there is no reason why you can't do this on a blank piece of paper, but I'm going to use this as a framework for how I'm going to go through this today. So I want to start in the middle, and then we're going to go to the left, and then we're going to go to the right. One of the things that I suggest that you watch prior to this video is Mr. Clifford has a video on the long run aggregate supply. So that would be a great place to watch first. I think you just get some really good information, and then that way this is going to feel that much easier for you. Okay? So this graph is kind of what I call the hero graph of AP Economics. It's something that you're going to be using for the remainder of the class. So it's really important that we get the foundation. So already in this unit, we've discussed what aggregate supply is and what aggregate demand is. So I'm going to just set up this middle graph with those labels, and you can do that with me. So we're going to put aggregate supply, aggregate demand, real GDP on the x-axis, price level on the y. I'm going to make a dotted line, and I'm going to label it with the equilibrium quantity. College Board prefers that we use a label Y there, so that's what I'm going to do. And then we have price level equilibrium as well. So now we're adding something new to this. We're learning that aggregate supply actually has something called short run and long run. So I'm going to take SR for short run, and I'm going to stick it in front of that AS. Just for a little bit of trivia for you, there is no such thing as a short run aggregate demand. So, long run aggregate demand. So we just keep it plain old aggregate demand. Okay. So full employment, what does that mean? Full employment, you have learned from other units. You know that full employment, when we look at the production possibilities curve, looked like a point that was hovering right on the line, okay? I like to say that the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph is a different window into the same economy. So the PPC offers us one insight, one window. We get to see the distribution of capital and consumer goods and whether or not we're utilizing our factors of production efficiently. This graph tells us about the price level in the economy and the real GDP. So this graph tells us about inflation, and it tells us about C plus IG plus G plus XN and how those things are interacting with one another. So other names that people have given this is long run equilibrium. And I'll show you what that means in a second by adding another line to this graph. So a lot of people call this long run equilibrium. Another way that people can refer to this is that we're operating at the natural, I'm abbreviating, rate of unemployment. So if you recall from Unit 2, the natural rate of unemployment is when we have no cyclical unemployment. So there's no recession and there's no inflationary gap. We just have only frictional and structural unemployment, and the unemployment rate is about 4 to 6%. So I'm going to mess this up for you a little. I apologize. I'm going to take this dotted line and I'm going to make it a solid line, and I'm going to go all the way up and all the way down, and I'm going to label it long run aggregate supply. The important thing to note is that the long run aggregate supply, the short run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand are all intersecting together at the same point. That's what we mean by long run equilibrium, is that all of those things are equal at the long run point. A lot of students say, well, what's the difference between short run and long run? The short answer is short run means these are the moment-to-moment changes in the economy that are happening right now. Long run means what happens when this economy has adjusted. And that's a more subjective time frame. You can't say it's a year, you can't say it's 10 years, you can't say it's 50. It happens when it happens. And for people who like to have a specific length assigned to short run and long run, I apologize. There is no specific length. Okay. If you watch Mr. Clifford's video, he went over with you why the long run aggregate supply is a vertical line. And it has to do with this adjusting, self-correcting mechanism that the economy is. You go back to Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, he says that, the invisible hand guides the market and the economy will self-adjust, and all of those things are true. But the problem is that we live in a world where we might not have 35 years to wait for the economy to adjust because of a recession. So we often have the government intervene and institute policies that are going to either help aggregate demand or short run aggregate supply get back to where it needs to be. So if you need a little bit more about why this is a vertical line, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm going to direct you to my co-teacher, Mr. Clifford, and I'm going to say, go watch his video because he animates it and he explains it. And that's really helpful. Okay. So you're going to get questions that ask you about to start at long run equilibrium or an economy that's fully employed or operating at the natural rate of unemployment. This is the graph you're going to start with. Okay. So let's go over here and let's pretend that you get a scenario that says we're operating below full employment or unemployment is above the natural rate of unemployment. So that, if the natural rate of unemployment is 4 to 6%, this would mean that unemployment is like 7%, right? Or you could just simply be told this is a recession. So what does that look like? So the first thing I like to do is I like to draw the basic short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand graphs again. And I put in the equilibriums because no matter which one I'm doing, it's got to have all these pieces. So why not just draw it? What a recession means, if you all remember when we did Unit 1, a recession was a point floating underneath the curve on the PPC. So how do you think you show that here? This point shows us what the economy is currently operating at. So a recession means we're not operating to full employment, right? So if the long run aggregate supply line symbolizes full employment and we're not operating at full employment, then I need to put the current equilibrium point in the short run on the inside or on the left of this long run aggregate supply. Let me show you a trick. This long run aggregate supply line is on the right, and we're experiencing a recession. Notice how they both start with the letter R. So you could use that as a strategy on how to remember, like, where do I put this long run aggregate supply line? Now, don't get frustrated with my drawing because you're probably looking over here and you're saying, well, she drew it in the middle, and then a recession, she drew it further down the number line. Pay no attention to that right now. What's really important is the relationship between the short run equilibrium point and the long run aggregate supply. So if the long run aggregate supply is to the right or further down the number line than your current level of production, it is the same as putting this point underneath the curve on the PPC. Both of those things are the same. They show the same economy, but a different window. So if you look at this, you'll see that there's a space in between where we're currently operating and where we should be with full employment. And that's why this is called a recessionary gap. The space in between the current short run equilibrium and full employment is known as a recessionary gap. So what do you think an inflationary gap looks like? It looks like quite the opposite, okay? So my camera doesn't really want to stay up here, so hang on one second. I'm just going to fold this. So an inflationary gap is when we have beyond full employment, and perhaps we are operating below the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, so again, I'm just going to put that short run aggregate supply, the aggregate demand, and I'm going to put price level, throw in my equilibriums here, and real GDP on this axis. Right now, if we're operating beyond full employment, that means this is where we're operating. So that means full employment would have to be on the inside of that. And this gap is now over here. So this is called an inflationary gap because full employment is only here on the number line, and where we currently are is inflated beyond what we need to be doing. When we studied the PPC, we did this by putting a point out here floating, not moving the whole line, because that's economic growth. This does not reflect economic growth in the long run. This only reflects economic growth in the short run, because the short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand are beyond the full employment. Now, can the long run aggregate supply scoop down the number line and join us over here? It sure can. But there's a few things that have to happen for that. So all we're doing with this video is just looking at the three places, the three positions that you could do on these graphs. And again, just like I said to you before, please don't worry about this full employment being like further down the number line than I had it over here in the middle. It doesn't really matter where it is, because we're not assigning like specific numbers to these x-axis numbers. All we're doing is trying to show the positioning of the short run versus the long run. So those are the three places to be. How could you practice this to make sure you know it? Take out a blank piece of paper and just write down recessionary gap, and with nothing in front of you, see if you can replicate this graph. And then do that for full employment and do it for inflationary gap as well. But you know what? Take a break. Do something else for 20 minutes, maybe a half hour. Go watch a show, go for a walk, maybe go talk to someone. And then come back to a blank piece of paper and see if you can do these three places, and then double check it with what you have here. You're going to have to pull these from memory. You're going to get FRQs that say, we're starting with an inflationary gap. You're starting with an inflationary gap or a recessionary gap. You're starting with full employment. That's your job, to be able to pull this one, or to pull this one, or to pull this one. All right, that's it for now. Bye-bye.